Opal Lawrence Historical Park was the original Stephen Decatur Lawrence farmstead. We have 13 acres of his original 640-acre farmstead. The Stephen Decatur family lived in this area from 1870 to when we took it over in late 1990s. Stephen Decatur Lawrence was known as Uncle Steve. He had 2 wives, both had the same name, Louisa, which was very convenient for Uncle Steve. The first Louisa he married the same year that Sam Bass robbed the train in downtown Mesquite in 1878. The first Louisa passed away in 1891, so she did not see the completion of this farmstead. 2 years later, Mr. Lawrence married the second Louisa, Louisa Walker. And to that union, he had 5 girls that the community named the Precious Jewels. Those girls were named Ruby, Pearl, Garnet, Opal, and Onyx. Thus, this is called Opal Lawrence Historical Park because Opal stayed on the farm her entire life and never married. She took care of her mother and the farmstead and her sister. Steve and his second wife also had 3 sons, Hugh, Hill, and Eddie Lawrence. The big house was begun in 1876. As the family began growing, so did the house. They began building up. They actually had children sleeping on the 3rd floor. It's not just attic space. The end of the 19th century, the house was completed except for the belvedere on top. It was probably 1900 when it was actually put on. These buildings that we're working on were their 2 closest outbuildings of this property that had probably 30 buildings at one time on it. Both buildings are pretty much, even though they're rotted, they're pretty much pristine as far as the way they were built.
So one of the things we're going to try and establish is in what order these buildings were constructed, what of the buildings is original, and what was added on to it at later dates. Our overall goal for the root cellar and curing shed and the wash house is to first clean them out of all their storage and artifacts, and then to stabilize the buildings. A good wind could possibly push either or both of them over. Okay. We're emptying out all the contents of things that have just been stored inside. With all the stuff falling on top of you, it's like working on the bottom of a saw pit. There's a team going through all these artifacts that will help us establish when the building was last used. And it does appear that it was in use at least as late as the 80s by some of the prescription bottle dates we're finding and the like.
Anybody in the restoration business knows how expensive these projects are. We have been saving for several years to come up with enough funds to get these 2 buildings done. We also have been watching Ron.
There's a better rendering of some of that fabric.
Wow, look at that one.
So you got 2 patterns.
And wanted him to do the restoration. The truth is once you lose any kind of heritage, you kind of lose a part of yourself. The best citizens are the ones that know their heritage, they know their history, and it's just a more enriching way of looking at life.
Well, it's certainly hollow underneath. There's brick. There was a well here, clearly. Yeah. What we found were the remnants of a well. There was a above ground part of the structure. They collapsed it in and then they just paved over it. It's been collecting water over the years, and I suspect if we dig down a little bit, the water table will come up to it pretty quickly. So pictures documented it, Pulley suggested it, and there it is.
The pictures we saw of the historic pictures of 1950, the outside perimeter of the well is just plastered. So it's hard to even tell exactly what type of brick they used. Some of the brick were fired, some of the brick were just dry pressed, some of them were just pressed clay and sun baked. I'm Tom Bolin, B-O-L-I-N. Thomas is the real name, but I go by Tom. We come from a history of craftsmen that really originally came over from Ireland and Switzerland. I got married into a family of bricklayers. It was love at first sight. 7 girls and 8 boys. They were all taught the trade, every one of them. When you start working with the ground, with the earth, the stone, and brick, it's just amazing what you can do.
This is how you would have started laundry day, usually on a Mondays. You would fill your bucket up and then you would add soap. By the 1870s, there were stores nearby and soap was brought there and you could buy it. You no longer had to make your own. But sometimes you did have to grate the soap from bars.
I am sitting in the opening to the root cellar. If not the first structure built on the farm, certainly one of the very earliest. It was important to the life of the farm, both from a safety standpoint and from a food waste standpoint. It would have provided a cool place to sleep at night in the summer, and a safe place in case of thunderstorms and tornadoes in the fall and the spring.
The root cellar was dug out of the ground, 4 to 5 feet deep, and then covered with 15 inches of dirt overhead. And that kept it much cooler here, even in the summer.
Whether this structure was built prior to the house or contemporaneous with the house, we don't know, but typically root cellars were one of the earlier outstructures built on farmsteads. This was the actual roof to that root cellar, and it was covered with earth. We found huge remnants of salt where they did salting of all the pork as we excavated the soil, much of which we think probably is river sand that came from some nearby creek.
This building is a curing shed. A curing shed was used to hang cured meat that is salted and rubbed down and dried out. There were nails on all the rafters and wires, and they hung the meat up to keep it dry and also to make it more accessible for taking and cutting off a chunk when you needed a chunk of fat back or pork belly or ham or all the meats that were hung and cured.
You under pressure? So as in any project, there's always the unexpected. We knew the north wall of the root cellar had collapsed in. We expected to be able to just excavate that soil and that we would find the brick and then rebuild the wall. Our supposition now is that as the root cellar came out of use and as that wall collapsed in, they were scavenging or stealing that brick for use in other parts of the farm. The restoration of the root cellar and the restoration of the curing shed had come to a halt until we could get this retaining wall addressed, because the structure sets on this wall, so consequently we had to get the wall done before we could continue with the restoration of the rest of the building.
My wife's grandfather started the masonry business back in the early 50s. Back in the day, the farmers would farm during the summer months. And since the communities were growing larger and larger, they needed bricks. So the farmers in the wintertime, they would make wood mold bricks. They would stack them in beehive style to start fires in the center. Therefore, they were what we would call a cold brick, which were not fired at a very high heat, but just long enough to get them to hold together. They would bring them to town on wagons. We worked on some buildings in Sulphur Springs that were not quite as old as 1800s. This would be my first one this old. There's a lot to go in it. You got to kind of understand how it was put together so you can safely take it back apart and then rebuild the structure the way it was.
We built a new retaining wall, and to the extent we can, we'll line it with the brick we have salvaged just to give it an aesthetic. When we were excavating the floor of the curing shed, we found clumps of salt that had been used in the process of curing the meat. And in one of these clumps, we found this wadded up section of newspaper.
Ron brought me this chunk of newspaper caked in salt and sand that came out of a curing shed. What he wanted to do was try and recover a date from these chunks of newspaper. What I have been doing today is to try to recover some information that will give us a clue as to the date of how long meat may have been cured in this shed. I work on all kinds of paper objects, no matter their type or age. Historic documents, prints, drawings, watercolors, even 3D paper objects like globes and sculptures. My initial degree is in studio art and chemistry. I was about halfway through undergrad and someone told me about the field of conservation. It seemed a perfect marriage of art and science. This is a layer with a different headline.
Oh.
This is a big chunk of, I think, a lot more layers, and it's just kind of bound up in that sand. The newspaper, it appears to have been folded and then folded and then folded again and then wrapped around something. The combination of the salt and the creek sand bricked it.
Yeah,
Under
so
there.
you're just kind of feeling your way through those layers between
Yeah.
us. Yeah, that's the other thing. We're not even looking at the reverse side yet.
Working very carefully with some soft brushes and tools have separated it into layers now. I mean, it's amazing. It's really not even fully wet on the inside. I will continue to try and get off as much salt and sand as I can. Then they will be air dried. I love to uncover things and learn.
So can you see a last name?
J.B. That's a strange last name. It looks like it says A-D-O-U-E.
A-D-O-U-E. Commerce.
National something of Commerce.
He returned to Dallas, practiced law for a year, and then worked with his father at the National Bank of Commerce, upon which he became president of his father's death in 1924.
Oh, well, there you go. So it was after 1924.
Jean Baptiste Adu.
Thank you.
He's written up in the Handbook of Texas.
I especially love projects like this that feel they have an aspect of detective work, right? So you feel like you're solving a mystery. I will be trying to put these back together as puzzle pieces, and then we can photograph them, and then they should be stable enough to perhaps go on exhibit.
People say, oh, it's just an old building. Why is it important? Preservation is about protecting the past for the future. You know, when it's gone, it's gone. You've lost that opportunity to appreciate that building, have that building be part of the city fabric once it's gone. Even if you put up something that's similar to it, it's not the same. You can't go into that building and say, this is how people lived 100 years ago. And to live on this land, their goal was to, you know, build a family and have that family grow and continue to live on the land and, you know, and improve their situation over the decades to come.
When you're working on a 150-year-old building like this one is, in keeping with how it was originally built, we're using cut nails from a company called Tremont out of Maine. It's quite possible that they made some of the nails that were originally used in this building. Nails are an authentic and reliable way to help date the age of a building. Didn't know I could drive a nail, did you? On the 150-year-old building, all the wood has already cured. Fresh wood shrinks as it ages, it dries out. That shrinkage binds onto the nails to give you a better fastener. But when your board is 150 years old, it doesn't shrink anymore. So where the head of the fastener will not be seen, we will use stainless steel screws. Cut nails come into existence around 1820. Then about the 1890s or so, we began to see the introduction of wire nails, the nails that are common to us today. That's a good way to help date a building because that transition seems to take place from about 1890 to 1900. So one of the major differences between a building that's 150 years old like this one versus buildings that are new today is the size of the timbers. The materials, the 2x on this structure are truly 2-inch by 4-inch as opposed to lumber you would get at a big box store today, which is typically 1.5 by 3.5, but we still call them 2x4s. In order to replicate the authentic look and keep with how this building was originally structured, we're having new lumber harvested in East Texas and milled to specific dimensions for this job. This is a modern day 2x4. We call it a 2x4, but in reality it's 3.5 inches wide by 1.5 inches deep. Here you have a piece of lumber that's a true 4-inch by 2-inch, so it corresponds with the original materials here in the buildings. So to most folks, this pile would just look like a pile of trash, but to us, it's gold. Many of these are original boards from the buildings, but they were in such decayed condition we couldn't use them in their original position. So we're taking these old boards, reclaiming them, and using them on the same structure. This is a pile of 1x6 tongue and groove that are identical to the siding that are on the lean-tos, to the curing shed. These were salvaged out of a turn-of-the-century house in the Gainesville area and are identical pretty much in age and style to what's on the lean-tos. Some of the boards that we needed, you're just not going to find old boards that long, that thick, and that wide. I have a supplier in East Texas who will go out and harvest trees and cut them to my dimensions. A couple of months ago, these were trees. When you look at the end of the grain, you can see these are representative of the original material because it's the heart of the tree, and so it has this nice tight grain that makes it a fairly stable piece of lumber to work with. And these were all hand nailed and face nailed. Probably the hardest to find are Bodark piers that these structures were originally set on. Bodark was quite prevalent in the 1850s to 1900s, but finding new ones today is difficult. It's fun to be in a root cellar where it's probably 25 degrees cooler down here than it is outside. Okay. I'm sure I'm feeling a little bit like the family did when they first finished this and were getting ready to use it. Because this is the end of the job. And this is just beautiful. That's a nail that won't come back out.
3 buildings together, the big house, this house, and then the root cellar next door, to me are the best part about this farmstead, in that this is everyday life. I mean, this is what the people did out here. You know, they went from one building to the next every day, all day long, doing their chores. So they've always been very important to me. I think the Lawrence family never expected it to survive all these years. Their construction and Ron's knowledge of that construction, that's what makes these projects worthwhile. The Lawrence Farmstead is the only property in Mesquite at this time that's on the National Register of Historic Places, and we're very proud of that. It's also a Texas recorded historic landmark, and it's a Century family farm through the Texas Agricultural Department. We're beginning now to fundraise for a church that we brought on the property so that we can have weddings, and the Lawrence family always had parties out here, and we want to continue that tradition and keep the Lawrence family tradition alive.